Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today we've got quite a collection of sources sent in by one of our listeners. We're looking at some really detailed reports here from big players, the UN, World Bank, EU, Doctors Without Borders, UNFTA, the ICRC. A real mix.
Yeah, it's a substantial set of documents, and they cover a lot of ground looking at the situation in Gaza and the West Bank from, well, multiple angles.
Exactly. We're talking international law, how it applies to armed conflict and occupation, but also the very real human impact, the economic fallout from recent events.
And then there's the whole side of humanitarian aid, what it takes to deliver it, the challenges, and even thinking about recovery down the line.
So our mission really is to unpack all of this, cull out the key insights from these reports, and help you make sense of the complex picture they paint of the realities on the ground.
That's right. And what's useful here is how these sources connect different dots. You've got analysis of specific events like the 2018 Great Return March protests.
Yeah.
But then linking that to the much broader ongoing humanitarian situation and the economic consequences that we're seeing unfold.
We'll try to weave together those legal findings with the practical effects on daily life, the sheer scale of the recovery needed.
Okay, so let's get into it. We'll start with the legal side, looking at what the reports say about the framework in those 2018 protests. Then we'll shift to the impact of the more recent conflict, the humanitarian crisis. It's pretty stark stuff.
And finally, touch on what these sources suggest about the path forward, recovery, resilience, all those challenges.
Right, so one of the core things these reports establish up front is the applicable legal framework. They're constantly referencing international humanitarian law, IHL, the laws of war, and also the specific laws of occupation. And they bring in precedents too, right? From international courts like the ICJ, cases that clarify how human rights law might apply even outside a state's borders. The Wall case is mentioned, for example.
Okay.
And it builds on things like the Hague Regulations, the Fourth Geneva Convention. These define an occupying power's responsibilities, like Article 43 of the Hague Regs talks about maintaining public order and safety.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. And then one report really gets into the 2018 Great Return March in Gaza, applying some of this framework. It describes how those protests started, initiated by refugees focusing on the right of return and also calling for an end to the restrictions on Gaza.
Yeah, and it mentions the organizing body, this higher national committee, apparently quite broad-based. Civil society, students, women's groups, even political factions like Fatah and Hamas were involved, though it specifically notes their armed wings weren't represented on the committee itself.
And the stated intention was peaceful protest.
That's what the report says the organizers aimed for. Fully peaceful from beginning to the end, demonstrators unarmed. It notes women were encouraged but participated less, partly due to, social factors and movement restrictions.
Then the reports turn to the response from the Israeli Security Forces, the ISF. What about their rules of engagement?
Well, the ISF's stated position, as cited in the report, was that lethal force was a last resort, only for imminent threats to life or limb. And even then, the supposed aim was to wound below the knee using less lethal means first. That was the claim.
But I sense a but coming.
Well, the report's own findings seem to paint a different picture. Based on their investigations, they found reasonable grounds to believe that in most cases they looked at, live ammunition was used against demonstrators who weren't posing an imminent threat, and that this use of force was, therefore, unlawful under international law.
And they argue alternatives were available.
Yes, they point to less lethal options and also the significant physical defenses already in place, fences, berms, security for nearby communities, things like that.
The injury data sounds pretty grim.
It is. The reports include charts showing that, overwhelmingly, injuries recorded between March and December 2018 were to the lower limbs, often over 80% in some areas.
Wow.
And they provide specific examples, which really drives it home. A 16-year-old girl shot in the leg 50 meters from the fence just planting a flag.
Just off
A 16-year-old boy shot at 80 meters, leg amputated later. A 15-year-old throwing tires, shot and killed. A taxi driver throwing stones, shot in both legs, even a clearly marked paramedic treating someone, shot in the leg. A journalist in a press vest, shot in the abdomen. Another student holding a flag, shot, leg amputated.
And the report's conclusion on these specific cases
Was that these individuals did not pose an imminent threat at the moment they were shot. They also note the type of injuries suggest high-velocity rounds, likely from sniper rifles, causing catastrophic damage.
Goodness, it mentions deaths from tear gas canisters, too.
Yeah, like a 15-year-old boy hit in the back of the head by one, fired apparently from a vehicle, drone, or rifle about 50 meters away.
So wrapping up this section on 2018, The report's main conclusion on the use of force.
Is that demonstrators killed or injured who weren't posing that imminent threat were shot in violation of their right to life. It also suggests that many of the demonstrators' actions, even things like throwing stones or burning tires, didn't necessarily meet the legal threshold for direct participation in hostilities under IHL.
Which raises questions about distinguishing between civilians and combatants.
Right, potential violations of the principle of distinction. And interestingly, the report suggests that if you apply international human rights law here, the threshold for triggering investigations into violations is actually lower than under IHL.
But actually getting accountability is another matter.
Exactly. The reports mention major challenges there, citing previous findings about pressure on civil society trying to document things, difficulties getting information. It's a recurring theme.
Okay, so that's a heavy but important look back at 2018 and the legal context. Fast forward to the period since October 2023. The picture from these sources is one of, well, utter devastation.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an assessment by the World Bank, UN, and EU, an interim one that tries to quantify it. They estimate physical damage in Gaza around almost 30 billion US dollars. Add economic and social losses, another 19 billion. So you're looking at nearly $50 billion in total effects.
Just staggering numbers. How does that compare to the economy?
The physical damage alone is about 1.8 times the entire annual GDP of both the West Bank and Gaza combined. Just gives you a sense of the scale.
And which sectors were hit hardest?
Housing, by a long shot. Over half the physical damage, $15.8 billion, was just homes, but other critical areas like commerce, industry, transport, water, sanitation all suffered massive damage too.
What about the health sector?
Huge impact there. Estimated losses of $6.3 billion. That's not just buildings, it's the collapse of services, the loss of personnel, over 1,700 health workers missing, it says, and the huge burden of injuries, disease, malnutrition, mental health crises.
And the MSF report gives a glimpse inside that health crisis.
It really does. Harrowing accounts of hospitals besieged, under fire, evacuation orders for places like Nasser Hospital where staff and patients were trapped. One of their staff described conditions inside Nasser desperate shortages, having to wash, sterilize, and reuse abdominal gauze, sometimes on multiple patients. Just unthinkable.
And the long-term medical needs.
Immense. The reports estimate thousands will need complex reconstructive surgery and rehabilitation, and they cite figures of between roughly 3,100 and 4,000 limb amputations since October 2023.
Beyond healthcare, the broader humanitarian picture.
Overwhelming. Nearly the whole population of Gaza affected by forced displacement. Evacuation orders covering something like 87% of the Strip.
And food?
Rampant insecurity. One report estimates over 50,000 children in Gaza will need treatment for acute malnutrition just this year in 2024. And getting aid in is still incredibly difficult. Access limitations, major security risks for aid workers.
The toll on aid workers themselves has been devastating.
Horrifically so. The reports tally the numbers killed since October 7th across Gaza and the West Bank, at least 885 healthcare providers, 280 aid workers, 128 journalists. Just awful numbers.
And it's important to remember the impact isn't only in Gaza.
Yeah.
What do the sources say about the West Bank?
They report a serious escalation there, too. Increased violence, military operations, settler violence, much tighter movement restrictions, all hitting businesses, farming, livelihoods hard. Unemployment shot up, estimated 35%. Food insecurity affecting over 600,000 people. The poverty rate apparently more than doubled to 28% by mid-2024.
There was also a specific focus on young people in one report.
Yes, the UNFPA report. It really emphasizes that most young Gazans have known nothing but the blockade reality since 2006. Multiple conflicts, constant restrictions. They face huge mental health needs, but getting targeted support to them is incredibly challenging right now.
What specific issues did it highlight for them?
Severe limits on movement, almost universal, 96% reported it. Lack of privacy in overcrowded shelters. Difficulty getting essentials, even things like menstrual hygiene products. And huge problems accessing healthcare, including for pregnant girls and young mothers, clinics closed, no money, unable to travel.
And the destruction of homes.
Made things even worse, especially for women, female-headed households, widows, children. The reports link this to increased risks of gender-based violence and deeper poverty and exclusion.
Okay, so the needs are just astronomical. What do these reports say about actually moving towards recovery and the challenges of doing humanitarian work in this kind of environment?
Well, that World Bank U assessment puts a price tag on recovery and reconstruction about $53 billion over, say, 5 to 8 years. Housing, business, health, agriculture, those are the areas needing the biggest investment according to their analysis.
What are the immediate priorities they identify?
Trying to restore basic social services, health, education, getting essential infrastructure back online, power, water, telecoms. And then there's the massive job of clearing rubble. We're talking maybe 41 to 47 million metric tons of debris. Huge logistical nightmare, plus the risk of unexploded bombs.
Trying to get some housing rehab and job creation going quickly, too.
Yes, those are flagged as urgent. Which brings us to an interesting ICRC report. It looks at humanitarian operations in these long, drawn-out urban conflicts, using Gaza as a kind of case study for thinking about better approaches.
How so?
It talks about this idea of operational resilience. Basically, how can aid operations better withstand shocks, absorb conflict impacts, and keep functioning? And bridging that gap between just emergency relief and longer-term development, which is really hard in ongoing conflicts.
Did it give concrete examples from Gaza?
It did, some interesting ones. They call them resilience projects, like coordinating different power sources for a hospital to create backup and flexibility, or using smart meters to make the power supply more reliable, or even setting up remote controls for water wells and generators so staff weren't put at risk during fighting.
Huh, that's fascinating. Finding practical ways to make vital systems tougher, even amidst the fighting.
Exactly. And the lessons they draw are about needing really deep analysis, technical know-how, but also cooperation from all sides, using what infrastructure is there and really listening to the community.
So community engagement is key.
Definitely. That smart meter project, for instance, worked partly because the community was organized enough to work with the ICRC and the authorities on it.
But despite these innovative ideas, the reports still point to massive obstacles for any real recovery.
Oh, absolutely. Beyond just the scale of destruction and the rubble, you've got the ongoing restrictions on movement for people and goods, the danger from unexploded ordnance everywhere, and limitations on importing essential materials, things deemed dual use, which are needed for rebuilding but face restrictions.
So pulling all this together from this deep dive, it's an incredibly complex and frankly devastating picture emerging from these reports on Gaza and the West Bank. We've traced the legal arguments around force from 2018, seen the sheer scale of human loss and infrastructure damage from the recent conflict laid out in these assessments.
Yeah, and the absolutely immense humanitarian needs that result. Plus, we've touched on some of the, well, the innovative but incredibly challenging efforts to build resilience and even start thinking about recovery. What really comes through is how interconnected everything is, the legal context, the reality people face every single day, the scale of the problems for residents and aid groups trying to help.
You really see how years of restrictions, compounded by the recent conflict, have just shattered almost every aspect of life. Basic services, health, mental well-being, the future for young people.
It's clear, isn't it? Rebuilding here isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's about trying to mend broken systems, shattered livelihoods, and somehow restore hope in what remains an incredibly volatile and constrained environment.
Which really leaves us and you, the listener, with a difficult question prompted by everything detailed in these reports. Given this depth of destruction and the ongoing constraints we've discussed, what does it actually mean for communities to move beyond just coping or adapting, to truly recover better when trapped in such a protracted conflict?